You are listening to Proof Text, a Glossa House podcast exploring Scripture and all things related to it. New episodes are released daily. For more information, check out glossahouse.com and subscribe to our channels on Spotify and YouTube. Welcome and enjoy.
Hello and welcome to Proof Text. I am Michael Halcomb, and I have the great privilege today of talking with Dr. Patrick Schreiner. This is my first time meeting him, and I gotta say, brother, I'm impressed by your CV, your writing. I mean, you're very young, and the writing you've done. Oh man, you've covered a lot of ground, a lot of territory, and yeah, it's very impressive. So I'm pulling up your faculty page here at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. That's where you're at currently, yeah?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, and maybe I look a little younger than I am, so I'm older than I look, maybe.
Thing, right?
So,
yeah.
It is a good thing, except when you go speak places and they're like, "Wait, are you the guy that's supposed to be speaking to us? You look like you're 25."
You've written on Acts. You have this illustrated guide to the New Testament. You got the theology of Acts, the body of Jesus, spatial analysis in the kingdom in Matthew. You've got the other book on Matthew, disciple and scribe, the first gospel and its portrait of Jesus, the Ascension, God's glory. There's a book of essays, and then a book on Baptist and the Christian tradition. So, and then you have the book on the Transfiguration, which is not yet listed on here, which I do want to talk about today. Let me start by asking you a simple question. How did you get into biblical studies?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I don't know how far I should go back, but my dad is also a teacher of theology and New Testament, and so part of it might be just attributed to being in his family. He was a great influence upon me. But honestly, growing up in high school, I didn't think I would go towards ministry. I was kind of interested in other things. In college, then I got interested in the ministry. I started being involved with Campus Crusade for Christ, started discipling some guys in a Bible study, graduated from college, went to seminary thinking I'd go towards ministry. And as I began to study, I just kind of fell in love with the academic side, reading, writing. I always loved reading, writing. That's kind of what I've loved to do. Got a journalism degree in college. So then after I was done with my MDiv, I just kind of thought, I felt like at the end of my MDiv, I'm just scratching the surface and I want more. Like I want to go in more depth and I want to learn more. So I decided to do a PhD just because that was really my desire. I knew actually the job market was pretty bad, that it wasn't financially probably the wisest decision at that point. But I based it on just like the Lord felt like he was calling me to keep studying, and I wanted to do that. And I had encouragement to do that. And so I did, and I didn't know what the Lord had for me in the future. But I went through the PhD and I loved it. I had so much fun. A lot of people don't enjoy it, or some people don't. The writing, the reading, the 3,000 pages you have to read. I loved it. I loved every minute of it. I thought it was so great, which made me think, maybe I belong in a space like this. And then after I graduated, right before I graduated from my PhD, I got a job at Western Seminary in Portland, Oregon, taught there for 6 years. And then we moved to Kansas City in 2020 for me to teach at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. And so I've been teaching here for about 4 years, and I can't believe, I've been teaching for 10 years. I feel like I still feel, you said I look young. I do feel young in terms of not my back. My back feels pretty bad, but I feel young in terms of just stepping in the classroom. And if you study more, you realize how much you don't know. And the more I've studied, the more I've realized, wow, I'm just continually scratching the surface. And so it feels like I'm always figuring out what I don't know even more and more. And so in that sense,
that's great.
It's a fun vocation.
Totally relate with the back.
You always have to push
43
yourself.
now,
and I enjoy doing that.
So
that's a little of the backstory.
Pain is non-stop, man. Yeah. So all the playing. I was a kicker in high school for the football team.
It's
I played
real.
soccer all the way,
Non-stop.
pre-kindergarten
That's right.
through college, and all that kicking. Man, it caught up to me now in my 40s, and I'm paying for it. I feel like I was just at the chiropractor yesterday. So, but so we could spend the whole episode talking
That's
about
right.
that. Yes. Um,
This could be
so
a
we
podcast
definitely
about our
have that in
backs.
common for sure. We have it's certainly a love for biblical studies and New Testament. I'm amazed at the breadth at which
People
you've written.
love this. The
I'm
people eat it up.
intrigued, and I admit I haven't had the opportunity to read the book Matthew, Disciple and Scribe, the first gospel, and its portrait of Jesus. Are you calling it first just because of its placement first in the canon, or do you think it's first in terms of primacy? Okay.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I'm calling it first just because its placement in the canon. In the early church, it was placed first almost exclusively, and so it does have a unique connection to the Old Testament. I think that's part of the reason why, according to the church fathers, they seem
Yeah.
to have thought it was written first. That's why they put it first. But yeah, I think a lot of times we look at the Gospels mainly from like historically what was written
Yeah.
first. Mark was written first, so we begin with that. I think there's something to be said for how the early church and how our canonical list kind of put these books, and that they were telling us something about how to interpret them. So when I say, yeah, the first gospel, just the first gospel in our canon, I think Mark's written first from my own studies. But I think Matthew's purposefully put the genealogy links the two testaments uniquely. So it's purposely put at the head of the New Testament canon. Like obviously Matthew couldn't have known that, but we do get a sense of how people have read it historically by its placement, and I think that can be helpful for us. So yeah, that was I think that was my second or third book after my dissertation, and a lot of times I tell people that's still one of my favorite books that I did. It was really fun. It was kind of a biblical theological view of Matthew, doing a lot of intertextuality with the Old Testament, but also doing some work on the first part is a little heavier lifting in terms of arguing that Matthew may have been a type of scribe for Jesus,
Right.
who Jesus mentions scribes in the Gospel of Matthew more than any other gospel, but it's usually critical of the scribes, the teachers of the law and the scribes. And I made the argument that Jesus is forming his own scribal school, who will then pass on his traditions, just like there are scribes in the Old Testament. And I think Matthew might be one of those scribes. I don't think it's like a formal scribal school, but you have in Matthew 23, like I send you prophets, wise men. I think he says, and scribes. And so it's an interesting thing, like he's sending out scribes into the nation. So in one sense, you could look at Matthew 28. Jesus commands his disciples to teach them everything I've commanded you. Now, how are they going to fulfill that task? Well, some of them will do that orally at Pentecost and beyond in Acts. You see that. Maybe Matthew does that through writing. Maybe John does that through writing, right? So we have Matthew and John who are written by apostles. And so that they are both scribes of Jesus who are implicitly speaking to the scribal school of their days. And part of the reason maybe why people looked at these gospels and were like, hey, these guys shouldn't be writing this. They're not trained in the same way we are. But then you read Matthew's gospel and you see
of Matthew.
His point is to prove Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. And so, yeah, he writes so that people will see the connection between the promises of the Old Testament and the fulfillment in the New, and how Jesus does fulfill those hopes. Yeah, I have. I've watched some of it. I think I'm a little behind now, but I actually really appreciate it because part of my argument in that book was that Matthew was the tax collector who probably had to take some notes. And so he would have had some sort of scribal skill, probably to take notes as a tax collector. So if you just go back into the history, some people are like, oh, there's no way Matthew and John wrote these because they wouldn't have been literate, or, they wouldn't have had those skills. But yeah, I think it's more likely that a tax collector would have been literate and could have written things down and made notes for the Roman Empire to know that they're getting the taxes that they need to. So that reality, even just seeing it in flesh in terms of a show, I thought was interesting to watch him scribble little notes. And then he's also portrayed as, is it like he has Asperger's or on the spectrum, autistic? What I appreciate about that was that Matthew is very concerned about structure and order in his gospel. And so I actually really like that portrayal of him, because he seems to be more carefully structured, and maybe that's not the best way to put it, but very carefully structured and putting things in very specific places in his gospel. So that kind of matches like the personality of the Matthew that they've given. Obviously, we don't know his personality.
On the theme of the Chosen,
I actually really appreciated it.
You may remember this,
have
but
enjoyed watching that show partially for that reason, because I thought,
maybe a year ago,
this is kind of the Matthew I was envisioning in a sense when I wrote my book.
The producer
that some
of
of
The
these
Chosen,
themes fit. Now I don't know how even self-conscious they were
posted
in
a tweet or
that sort of
on
personality
Facebook
for
or something like this,
for that
and,
role, but it does kind of fit the gospel, which is kind of fun to me.
Statement that essentially, like, the Transfiguration is pointless. There's no need for a Transfiguration. Like, what's the point of it? And so you're a guy who's sat down and you've invested a lot of time. You've written an entire book on the Transfiguration. I think you would beg to differ, but you can correct me if I'm wrong on that. So, what's your initial reaction to a statement like that? I can't remember the exact way he worded the tweet, but it's something that.
Yeah. Genuine from Yeah, and there might have even been debate about whether that was because I remember that because somebody sent it to me because they knew I was working on the Transfiguration. And if I remember correctly, there may have been some debate whether that was actually genuine in terms of from Dallas Jenkins or from someone else. But the point still stands that there is a tendency. I don't know. I'm even thinking back, and now we're on to my mind's at like Jesus shows or Jesus movies. Very few of them display the Transfiguration. I don't remember seeing them very much, and so I think The Chosen, especially, they're trying to portray Jesus in a very kind of earthly, embodied, which is true, but they're not. It doesn't feel like they're going to his like divinity as much. Which is again, it's fine, because how do you portray that on like a screen? But all that to say, we believe he's the God man, right? The man side and the God side. There's two natures in one person. And the other thing about the Transfiguration, which would be hard to do on video, is it's hard to think of a way to do it that's not cheesy, in a way that maybe is hard to portray. So, but I think that kind of speaks to the deeper reality that if you ask someone to summarize Jesus's life, what if I gave you 5 minutes? What if I gave you 10 minutes? Would you include the Transfiguration? I think most people probably wouldn't, as kind of the key moment in his life, even if you have a little bit longer. And there's so many reasons that I can talk to you about that. But one of the reasons is because it does, it's an event where it's almost sitting out of place chronologically, because Jesus shows them his future, and I say pre-existent glory, but his future glory before that glory is actually given to him. And so it's like he shines with light, and then he goes back to being kind of normal, Jesus. And we just don't really know what to do with it. And it's also like, how does this contribute to his mission and his work? Like, you cut out the Transfiguration, and really the story, it feels like, is largely the same, right? Like, he didn't have to do that. He gives them hope, but he still goes to the cross. So how does it contribute to the gospel of our salvation? So in some sense, yeah, it just feels like we are like, okay, this is a really spiritual, mystical, weird event, and we've got nothing like it in our culture, and we don't understand it. And so that's cool. Went up on a mountain, shone brightly, and then he came down the mountain and then went to the cross. We just don't know what to do with it. But I make the argument that the early church, the scriptures themselves, have made the Transfiguration just a really important part of Christology and a part of his life. And we would do well to spend more time thinking about it. And it does speak to, I alluded to earlier with just the chosen, the dual nature of Christ. The early church, this is what they were dealing with. They were dealing with the nature of the identity of Christ. But really, the Gospels are written about the identity of Christ. John says, I write these things that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah and the Son of God. That's identity issues. So however much you want to, I don't know, be frustrated with scholars to talk about the identity of Jesus so much, that's what I think the Gospels are about. Are you convinced that he's Lord and Messiah? Are you convinced that he's the Son of God? And the Transfiguration is this narrative where the divine and human aspects of Christ meet in a way that shows them both. So the way I like to put it is, Jesus's humanity is glorified and his divinity is revealed in the Transfiguration. And there's narratives in the Gospels where sometimes his humanity is more emphasized or his divinity, but the Transfiguration both kind of come together where his flesh is not canceled out or torn away from him, but rather it's through his flesh that his divinity is seen, which is a picture of what we will see in the last day. We will see the Son, Jesus Christ, but see the Son in all of his glory, and showing us what glorified humanity is, showing us divinity through humanity, because God dwells in unapproachable light, and we can only see him in the face of Jesus Christ. So, man, if you begin to start teasing out these images of cloud and light and overshadowing and his face and the mountain and his clothes and Moses and Elijah, it starts to bring the whole Bible together in a unique way, where you start to think about the Gospels and the epistles, where speak about walking in the light and how God is light, and how the Spirit is described in the Old Testament as a type of cloud that overshadows us. The Spirit overshadowed Mary. She became pregnant.
So you have the book on the Transfiguration. You just mentioned
so there's just project. There's just so much in there that the scriptures and the way Matthew tells it, he's bringing so many things together.
Curious,
and
before we move
one
over
of my
to
kind of
talk about the Ascension,
pet projects is to go to neglected events in Christ's life,
Transfiguration,
and to show people, no, this is really important too.
Connections between
we need to look at the whole
Jesus'
picture of
baptism,
Christ. And that's not to add one more thing to talk about with Christ, but rather to say,
riff on that for a minute.
Every single synoptic gospel records this event, and John uses the images throughout his gospel. They all thought it was very important, so we should think it's important. Yeah. Yeah, there's so much to say here. I mean, you have obviously the one clear connection that you have is that he's called the beloved son, right? It's the exact same thing. The Father's voice comes and says, "This is my beloved son." And so there's differences though in the narrative too. And one of the reasons why these two scenes are so important is because it's like the heavens open up, and the Father declares the identity of this figure. This is my beloved son, I think alluding to Psalm 2:7, probably alluding my chosen one, Isaiah 42:1, maybe even alluding to Genesis 22:2, when Abraham and Isaac go up the mountain and Abraham keeps calling him his beloved son. But yeah, they're also important, and there's links between them because I think they're both, as I mentioned earlier, Trinitarian scenes. Most people just think of the baptism as the Trinitarian scene because you have the Father's voice, you have the Son, and then you have the dove as the Spirit, which they identify as the Spirit. But the church fathers all said, every single one said that the cloud is the Spirit in the Transfiguration scene. So you have, again, the Father's voice, and you have the Son being glorified, right? Transfigured. And then you have the Spirit cloud overshadowing. So you have this, he's shining bright. There's kind of priestly themes there. He's in the glory cloud, right? He's in the true temple, and the voice is coming. So there's so much to say there. The other thing to say is there's actually contrast, though, between these two scenes. Jesus's baptism would have been taken place at a low place. How do we know that's true? Well, water goes to the lowest place, right? And so for the most part, unless you're on a mountain, we know it's in the Jordan River where he was baptized. That would be a low place. And the Transfiguration takes place on a high place. Jesus's baptism speaks, I think, more to Jesus's suffering. He goes under the water, symbolizing a type of going under the waters of chaos and death. He is raised to life, I think, kind of symbolically in the baptism. But the Transfiguration is a scene full of light and glory. So you have kind of a death scene and then a life scene. So both of these kind of match but contrast in that way. The other thing you could say is that the baptism, how would I put this? The baptism is the inauguration of Jesus' ministry as a whole. The Transfiguration is the gateway to Jesus going to the cross. It's right after the Transfiguration, or right before, maybe actually even, I'm trying to remember correctly, but very near there, he then sets his face to go to Jerusalem. And so it occurs at the same place, actually, in every single synoptic gospel, that it's the transition point between his Galilee ministry and his Jerusalem ministry. And so both are kind of like gateways into his ministry, which is interesting. And if you think about the Transfiguration from that view, the baptism reveals this is the Son who will die. The Transfiguration reveals this is the Son who will die, but will also be glorified post suffering. And so before you get to the passion narrative, the trials, people mocking him, his crucifixion, Jesus says, okay, let me show you what's going to happen after that. And it's a picture of the glory that he's going to receive. And ultimately, that's what the Transfiguration does for the disciples. Jesus has told them he's going to go to his death. He's going to die. He's going to be delivered over. But on the third day, he's going to rise again. The disciples are like, what are you talking about? You can't die. You're the Messiah. And he's like, well, let me show you the glory that is to come because of my suffering. And so there's so much in there that you can kind of compare and contrast. Also, the final thing, I'm just kind of riffing on it. I know that's the asked me to do, but the final thing to think about is in the baptism, Jesus goes under the waters at the Jordan River, symbolizing kind of a new Exodus theme. So you have this kind of new Exodus theme in the baptism. And in Luke's account of the Transfiguration, he tells us what Moses and Elijah and Jesus are talking about. They're talking about Jesus's departure, which in the Greek is his exodus, his departure, which you could interpret that his exodus as in his death. I think that's what he's referring to. You could interpret it maybe about his ascension, but I think it's more likely Moses is on the mountain with Jesus and they're having a conversation about the previous exodus and then the exodus that Jesus is going to accomplish. And so you've got kind of new Exodus themes in both of those.
As I was preaching, so I'm preaching through Mark. I've been preaching through the Gospel of Mark for almost a little over 2 years now, just going word by word, episode by episode. So we were in the Transfiguration not too long ago, working on a commentary on Mark as well. I was intrigued by the connections. You were talking about, sort of a new Exodus, the beginning of Mark, the baptism scene especially. But when we look at the Transfiguration, sort of the connections between Exodus 24, 1 Kings 19, how they're sort of shaped very similar to the Transfiguration scenes, or the Transfiguration scene, because you have the mountain featured in those. You have companions involved. You have God's glory involved in each scene. Like God's presence is there. God speaks. In each scene, there's a tent or a tent-like dwelling. and some scenes an astonished crowd. And before that, there's feeding or eating involved, and there's messenger language and a call to obey. Like there's
Yeah.
all these amazing connections. It seems like the way that, at least for Mark, the way he's framed this story, that can't be accidental. So I don't know. I find that pretty interesting. And so then I'm asking, like, well, why? Why is he doing this?
Yeah.
Then you have that interesting language of the clothes, turning white, whiter than like anything anybody's ever seen, right?
Right.
The purity language, which is so. As I'm preparing for the sermon and working on the commentary, like I got stuck on that. I couldn't leave. I couldn't leave that. So I spent a lot of time thinking about the idea of a fuller, right? Someone who mends or washes or bleaches clothes, and thinking that I think that's an important detail too. That often, the event often gets overlooked, but even within the event, that bit about the white clothing is often sort of just maybe skimmed over a little bit.
Sure.
Yeah. So in this idea that perhaps Jesus is like this is a divine fooler, right? Like it's symbolizing the purity of Christ, and that Christ has the ability to make pure. Which I think is pretty fascinating. I could probably talk about that all day, but I'm in agreement with you that this is a really important scene, an important episode, important story that deserves more airtime.
Yeah, and I think Mark. I mean, you asked why is he? I think all the Gospels are alluding to Exodus 24 and 1 Kings 19, but Mark as well. All of them are communicating something by that. It's like I always give the example of when our generation watches the new Star Wars and we see all the echoes to the old Star Wars, with Rey in the desert, and you're like, wait, I've seen this scene before, and then it shifts on you and there's something different, and you're like, oh, they're doing something with this scene. But you can also watch that movie and not have watched the previous Star Wars and say, oh, I get the story, it's fine. But there's a depth to the story if you know the previous story that came before, and it gives it kind of this it fills it out in a way, and you kind of can see what's different. But why are the gospel writers doing this? I think you could say so many things, but they are portraying Jesus as the new Moses who goes up the mountain. He is the new leader, the new prophet. Deuteronomy 15 and 18 prophesied that a new prophet would come. And interestingly, it's Moses and Elijah who are with him. And then the Father's voice, though, comes and says, listen to him. And so one of the big debates about Jesus is, well, how does he interact with the law and the prophets? Well, Moses and Elijah stand for the law and the prophets. And so when the Father's voice comes, the command, the only imperative in this whole scene is listen to him. The Father is putting his voice above the law and the prophets. Well, Jesus, and above maybe isn't the best way to put it, but he is superior. But Jesus also affirms the authority of the law and the prophets. So it's listen to him, and you listen to the prophets and the law because of him, because of who he is and who I am. And so there's so much going on there in terms of Jesus being this new Moses figure. But in my book, I also argue, though, that this scene should be contrasted to Exodus 24, because Jesus is not only the new Moses who climbs the mountain with three companions, like Moses climbs Mount Sinai with three companions, but Moses went up the mountain to see God, and the disciples go up the mountain to see God, and they see God in the person of Jesus Christ. And so Jesus is both like Moses and unlike Moses, because Moses' face, Matthew speaks of Moses' face shining. Mark doesn't speak of that, but Matthew speaks of Jesus' face shining, which clearly is an echo to Moses, whose face also shone after he saw God. But notice that Moses' face shines because he sees God. Who does Jesus see? Well, in one sense, theologically, you could say he sees the Father at all times. But in another sense, because he is one with the Father, his face shines because of who he is. He doesn't look towards anyone else because he is the one God of Israel. And so Moses' face is a reflection of the glory that he perceives on Mount Sinai. Jesus's face is the overpouring and the outflow of the glory that is inherently his. So there's both comparison and contrast between Jesus and Moses. And then you spoke briefly about the white clothes that no OxyClean could even get them whiter. You can't go to any laundromat and make them any whiter. And I'm so glad that you spent time thinking about that, because I do think as Protestants, it's harder for us to know what to do with kind of symbols like that, images. We're better at Pauline literature where it gives us a command and we know what to do with it. But it's like, okay, white, really, really white. What does that mean? And there's so much we could say, but the first thing that I thought of was, okay, my way of studying the scripture is, well, where else do we see white clothes? What does it tell me? Like, great, he's got a white shirt on. That's wonderful. So here's a few like just biblical references you can think about with white clothes. First of all, you can think about Daniel 7, the Ancient of Days. The Ancient of Days is clothed in white and he has white hair. So that's one reference you can think of. And in that context, I do think it's the purity of his judgment, the purity of his being. It speaks of fire coming forth from the throne to judge the beasts in Daniel 7. You also have dazzling white clothes in angels who appear at Jesus' resurrection before the tomb. Now, what does that communicate? Why do they have white clothes? Well, I think there's an indication that they're sent by God. They're from the heavens. They're heavenly beings who are sent to the earth. And on earth, they're going to show up as bright figures because heaven has come to earth in their person. Now, I think in the same way, Jesus is a heavenly being who's come to earth, and therefore it's appropriate that his clothes appear as white. So in a sense, he's been hiding his divinity under his humanity, but in the Transfiguration, he now reveals it. Then finally, the other reference I'd want to think through is, even though in Exodus, what chapter is it? Maybe Exodus 18. I don't know. Yeah, maybe it's 32. No, I don't know. I don't know the chapter. I'll stop guessing. But in one of the chapters where it talks about the high priestly robes, it doesn't say their robes are white. But the implication is that their linen garments are. They have purple on. They have some scarlet, I think it is, some different colors on. But as people have studied what the priests are wearing, it's it's a bright and shiny garment. And so again, I think there's maybe priestly themes happening here as well. So heavenly being, purity, holiness, sent one, and then priestly themes are all here. And so when you pause and think about like, why are his clothes so white? We forget to ask these questions because we read so quickly and we're just like, cool, he had white clothes. I don't know what that means. Like, but it's an important detail because all of the gospel writers speak about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. So you've picked up on this. Well, the baptism gets talked about. I think a lot of people, talk about the baptism. The Transfiguration, I agree, not so much. And then the Ascension, that's another very much neglected topic, and you've written on that. Say a little bit about that. Why? We do cross and resurrection. Why do we leave that off? Because it's absolutely important. If there was no Ascension, then that's a major problem.
Yeah, we probably leave it off because we think the resurrection is the end of the story. Once he's raised from the dead, he's exalted and that's it. But it's very clear in the scriptures that there's still another thing to happen, and that is the enthronement of the Son. So the resurrection proclaims that Jesus lives. The Ascension proclaims that Jesus reigns. So the Ascension is a coronation to the highest throne. Kings of the earth desire to sit upon the throne on earth. Jesus is enthroned in the heavens, which stands above the earth. So in Jesus's Great Commission, he says, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. I think that's looking forward to the Ascension and saying, at the Ascension, that's kind of where I sit down now at the right hand of the Father, and I receive all that authority. So one of the big points that I want to just tell people is the story's not over at the resurrection. There's another moment that needs to happen. And I typically give the example from John's Gospel where Mary comes to Jesus and she hugs him when she realizes he's not the gardener. And he says, "Don't cling to me, for I haven't ascended yet to the Father." In other words, it ain't over yet, right?
Right.
And we know that's true, even though only Luke actually records it in both Luke and Acts. And then the other thing to say is we actually have these tropes and these symbols of someone ascending to the throne and not being seated. We actually have that in our culture today. So you think about King Charles, he was declared to be the king when the queen died, but he wasn't coronated as king until coronation day, right? And so even when you think about, I mean, maybe we're not as used to that being Americans, right? But in England, you still have that idea that there's a declaration of this is the new king, but there's a coronation day where he's installed. And so that is the same reality with the ascension. It's the installation of the king. Then the other thing I'd say for why it's so important is a lot of times we think about what Jesus has done, what he will do, and we don't always think about what Jesus is doing now.
Yes,
Jesus is still acting in the heavens, I would argue, as our prophet, priest, and king. And he's still active, interceding, building his church, and reigning over all. And so it's not like Jesus is up there sitting, like waiting for this thing to get over. He's still acting as the Lord and Messiah. And we would do well to focus more on his current and present activity.
Yes, I agree. Particularly with Protestants, we're sort of focused back on the cross, right?
Yep.
And there's a place for that. And we sort of skip right from the cross and resurrection to the second coming.
That's right.
And I think there's this huge gap. We forget that Christ is interceding for us, which is incredibly important. And there's a richness to the Christian life that is so lost when we don't recognize that and when we neglect that. That Christ is interceding for us, just as the Spirit is groaning in us. Right? Yeah. You essentially have the Spirit and the Christ interceding for us, and Protestants, at least in my experience, tend to do very little with that.
That's right, and it's such an encouraging doctrine and reality that Christ is praying for us.
Yes,
and we know about that from Hebrews and from Paul, but that he continually prays for us is something that should be a great comfort to Christians.
Yeah. Another thing that I feel like sort of gets lost in the mix there, we're very keen on referring to Christ as Lord and Savior and, these other things, but very rarely do we talk about him as brother.
That's right.
And this is something else. And I don't know if you touch on that in any of your works, but that is one of those places I feel is very neglected. That Jesus, our brother, is doing these things, and not to the neglect of prophet, priest, king, Lord, Savior, but that's a very important part of his identity as well.
Yeah, I agree too. I haven't done a lot with that, but very clearly in Hebrews, it speaks about our ascended Lord as our brother. And I did do reflection on Ephesians 2 says you're seated with Christ in the heavens already now. And I think we read a text like that and we're like, well, how is that possible? Because I'm sitting on the couch right now. This doesn't make sense. But he's our brother in that the rest of the scriptures give another image of that. He's the head and we are the body. The church is the body, and where the head is in the heavens and his body is on the earth. Like the church is on the earth. So in one sense, we're on the earth because we're his body. In another sense, we're in the heavens because he's the head. And that just confirms the idea of he's our brother. He's one with us and we are one with him. That's the doctrine of union with Christ. He is our representative. And therefore, when he prays before the Father, you think about the high priest would go before Yahweh and he would have the 12 tribes etched upon his chest and shoulders on the stones. In the same way, I think we have hymns. His name is written on my hands, or my name is written on his hands. And I think it's written on his clothes in a sense. And he represents us before the Father as our true elder brother.
Yeah, that's great. Well, man, you've got you've done a lot of great work. You're doing a lot of great things. Is there anything you have anything coming, like forthcoming, that you'd like to talk about or share?
What is forthcoming? In a few weeks, I have June 1st. I have a book coming out on the four gospels, which is just a textbook on the four gospels, but it's very focused on biblical theology. It's meant to be used in maybe a seminary or college kind of classroom, but it's also kind of built for maybe church institutes or training centers because it's a shorter textbook that I hope is easier to read, but kind of gets them into the flow of the whole Bible and how the Gospels connect with the Old Testament and the Gospel story and even life application. So that's coming out in, I think, June 1st, really soon here. And then the next book that I'm kind of finished. Well, I have two books that I'm kind of finishing up right now, but one of them that I'm super excited about is a book on hermeneutics and interpretation. And I'm arguing that we ought to recover the fourfold sense of the early church fathers: the literal sense, the allegorical sense, the tropological sense, and anagogical sense. And that, it is, we probably need to modernize it in some ways, but it's the way that we naturally read the scriptures as Christians, that we're supposed to read it according to its historical context and grammatical context. Allegorical, I would argue, is just the Christological context. Tropological is, what does that mean for me? Like in terms of morality. And then anagogically, the one we probably neglect maybe the most is how does it point us towards the future? And I'm making the argument that most texts can be run through that kind of fourfold sense. And that's a helpful way of looking at things, so that when you come to a text, like a famous text like David and Goliath, yes, it's literal, historical, this event happened. But David is also a type of Christ, and Goliath is a type of sin and Satan and death. And yes, it can be an encouragement for us to put on the armor of the Lord, Ephesians 6, and to fight against the arrows of the devil himself. I think Ephesians speaks to that. And ultimately, it points to Christ as our great warrior who will one day come and cut off the head of the serpent, basically. And so I think all those things are actually good ways of looking at a text, but all the rule is it has to all be based on the literal sense. And once you go away from the literal sense, then you're actually probably not doing good exegesis anymore. So I'm going to be making the argument, and I am making the argument, that we would do well to recover that kind of fourfold sense, and especially pastors and those who lead Bible studies can encourage those who are saying, what does this text mean to me? They're asking a good question, but they're asking it in the wrong order. In other words, the fourfold sense says first the literal sense, then the Christological sense, then ask, what does it mean to me? In other words, that's a great question to ask, but there's two questions to ask before that. And the order is super important. And so I think we can come alongside people who are just starting to read their Bible, and we can encourage them in what they're doing, and then say, you should be asking what it means to you, but you should also be asking, like, what is maybe the original meaning of this text to these people?
Right.
And then we can ask, and how does it connect to the gospel? And then we can ask, now how does that affect me? And then how does it point us to our future? So I'm pretty excited about that book.
Yeah, that sounds great. I'm a pastor, and pastor full-time, teach part-time at the moment, but one of the ministries we have is a Muay Thai ministry. So we like punch and kick each other for 45 minutes and then do a Bible study,
Nice.
And so one of the other guys in our congregation leads that Muay Thai Bible study, and we were just doing that Monday. Then we have another one coming up this Saturday. But I'm sitting there participating in this sort of discussion, and that's exactly what happened at the study. We read the passage, and then immediately it's like, boom, boom, let's jump to what does this mean to me? And totally ripped out of context. And I'm trying to get the train back on the tracks, right, in the middle of that. But oh my gosh, once the train goes off the tracks, it's nearly
hard.
impossible to get it back on.
Yep. Yeah.
So that's good. I'll check that out for sure. Well, man, I know it's been good talking to you. I know you got some stuff coming up here, and so I want to hop off. But I usually ask at the end of these episodes if people have what I call a parting shot. It was like a favorite quote or saying, song lyric, Bible verse, anything that comes to mind sometimes that's too much of putting people on the spot and they can't think of anything. But anything come to mind, like a saying, lyric, verse that you could leave people with, something additional to chew on?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have the quote in my mind, and I don't remember who said this. It might have been Henry David Thoreau or Ralph Waldo Emerson. I can't remember which one, but they made the comment that to love something is to give it attention. Anything you give attention to, you are giving love to. And I think that for some reason that's been sticking in my head in terms of a parting shot. Like anything you give attention to, you are giving love to, and that can either be distorted if it's something that doesn't need your attention,
Right.
or and it's going to require a lot of you out of you, or think about how you spend your time and what are you giving your attention to. That'll show you what you love. And so I think attention and love are kind of they coincide.
Great. Wow, that's excellent. So, friends, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Check out Dr. Schreiner's CV, his works. Oh my gosh, so much to read here. You could spend years reading all that he has written. He's got some great stuff coming down the line. You can see his faculty page at mbts.edu, which I was showing earlier in the episode. He's also on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, all the things. So you can follow him there, and there are links on that faculty page. But we're going to wrap it up there. Thanks so much, Dr. Schreiner, for chatting. It's good meeting you for the first time, and appreciate you sharing, brother. Yeah, so we're going to stop there.
Thanks so much, Michael.
We hope that helps.
Interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Glossa House can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Glossa House offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to glossahouse.com today. Glossa House, language resources for the global community.